Okay, no, he told me it was fixed. Thank you, everyone. Please, again, we have a lot of people that want seats, so if you can make sure tote bags are not on seats, you squeeze in so there's not an empty single seat in a row, that would be really helpful. Just to make sure we get everybody a seat. Just quickly, again, the announcements. Thank you so much for being here. Right after this panel, all of our authors will be going to the book signing tent, so you can buy their books at the book sales tent from Bunch of Grapes, and then you can go right over to the book signing tent and they will sign your book for you. Don't go hungry again. Remember, our vendors from Martha's Vineyard are here offering lots of snacks, so make sure. And we do have some tote bags for sale, the beautiful Martha's Vineyard Book Festival tote bags. Yeah. We tried to do questions in the last panel, and we never got to it because there was so many good questions from the moderator. So if we have time, we'll do questions from the audience, but we'll see how it goes. But I'm going to introduce our next panel and get started quickly so they have enough time. Okay, we're starting. Shh. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, I need my glasses. This morning's second panel explores the road to autocracy, governments, universities, and the law with Stephen Hahn, Andrew Lawler, Jason Stanley, and Kara Swisher. Moderated by Andrew Celli or Celli? Celli, thank you. Struggles for liberty, equality, democracy, and the rule of law, and resistance to those ideals have defined the American project. The panel will explore the roots of the current assault on democratic values and norms and invite a discussion of the vital role of historical understanding in the struggle for the future. Stephen Hahn is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian whose book, Illiberal America, uncovers the powerful, deep-seated illiberalism that is part of the American bedrock. Hahn is a professor of history at New York University and a specialist on the history of the 19th century and the comparative history of slavery and emancipation. His 2004 work, A Nation Under Our Feet, received the Pulitzer Prize in History. Andrew Lawler is a North Carolina-based author of A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. The book explores the largely untold story of a rebellion in Virginia that will forever change our understanding of the American Revolution. He is the author of the national bestsellers, The Secret Token and Under Jerusalem. Jason Stanley is the Bissell Hyde Chair in the American Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and a best-selling author of How Fascism Works. I need to know more about that. And Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Drawing on urgent, fact-based analysis, it warns that democracy depends on shared reality and collective memory, both under threat by authoritarian forces rewriting history. And finally, Kara Swisher is a veteran tech journalist and podcast host. Her third book, Burn Book, A Tech Love Story, was an instant New York Times bestseller that blends memoir, history, and insider analysis of the tech industry's most powerful figures. Kara Swisher hosts two podcasts, On with Kara Swisher and Pivot. And our moderator, Andrew Celli, is a founding partner of, wait for it, Emery, Celli, Brinkerhoff, Abidi, Ward, and Maisel.
A lot of lawyers.
And a prominent trial and appellate lawyer known for his works in civil rights, constitutional law, and complex public interest litigation. A former chief of the Civil Rights Bureau in the New York State Attorney General's office, he served on the board of Grand Street Settlement and Reprieve US. And Andrew, take it away.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. So the topic today is...
Sorry, one more thing. Can everyone please turn off your cell phone ringers? I forget all the time. Please do not forget. Thank you. Apologies.
First of all, I want to say thank you to this amazing panel. I have had the joy of reading their books and thinking about their books for the last 4 weeks or so, and I have a million questions, but we only have an hour, so we'll hit the highlights. The topic today is the road to autocracy, government, universities, and the law. And it occurs to me that the road metaphor is a metaphor. We're traveling from a place of democracy to a place of autocracy, is the metaphor. But there are other possible metaphors. In June of this year, in the New York Review of Books, Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Mary Lynn Robinson called our current situation a nation under occupation, kind of like, Holland in 1940. Or maybe it's a different metaphor. Maybe we're stuck in the big muddy where we've always been. Maybe this is the place that is America. So we have these different metaphors and ways of thinking, and then we are graced to begin with two historians who can help us unpack this. So let's start. Are we headed in a dark direction, or is just this the same old, same old? I'm going to start with Andrew Lawler, whose book on the founding of the Republic, pre-Republic, 1775, it seems to me is a pretty good place to start historically. Andrew.
Thank you, Andy. I actually called Andy up and said, are you sure I'm supposed to be on this panel? Because I wrote a book about people who claimed that they were leaving an autocracy back in 1776. But then we had a chat, and I realized, okay, maybe there is something to what I've written that might be relevant to today. So my book is about not about Lexington and Concord, which up here in New England everybody knows about, but I wrote about what happened in Virginia in 1775. Because without Virginia, which was the largest, wealthiest, and most populous colony, there would have been no United States. Without the agreement of the Virginia gentry, the tobacco planters who ran that state, that colony at the time, there could not have been a united effort to throw off the relationship with Britain. So I was inspired to write this story because I stumbled on the facts that I was not told as a child growing up in Virginia, and I realized that nobody had actually written about what took place step by step in that colony. Most of the focus, of course, has always been on New England, and as I was researching this story, I started to see really similar threads running from the beginning of the Republic up until today. I mean, I'm reading the headlines, and I'm realizing that my research seems to be focused on the origin of issues like gun control, disputes over immigration, obviously race, and also the relationship to power that people in the early republic had. So I've been a little stunned to see what I see as kind of a cycle, these threads running through American history that while they may not be the same, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, that we're really in a serious, rhyming stanza right now. And so my view is, at the end of my research, I realized that what's important, although it's a great story I wanted to tell in and of itself, but I wanted to really get at the heart of how we got to this place. And I'm a big fan of going back to origins. So I feel like I uncovered some of the origins of these disputes that are in the headlines today. So I'm hoping that can provide a little background for the rest of the folks who are speaking about what's happening today.
Stephen Hind's book is called Illiberal America, which kind of gives away the answer, it seems to me. But it's a sweeping piece about the entire history of the country, and so I'll turn next to Steve.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor both to be at the festival and to be on this panel. I understand the appeal of trying to imagine the last decade as something that does not fit in American history and the American experience, but of course, as a historian, I knew a lot better. And I was really struck way back in 2015-16 about how many educated observers talked about the way in which Donald Trump violated liberal democratic norms. And to me, that's a luxury that relatively few people in this country have. That for people of African descent, people of color, immigrants, working class, poor white people and black people, liberal democracy has not been the norm in their own experience and their history. So I decided that I would try to write a book that really took a deep dive and discuss the ways in which what I call illiberalism had deep roots in the United States, going back to the colonial period in the 17th century, and moved in many ways and in changing forms to the present day. It really challenges what I would say is an interpretation of American history that puts liberalism at the center and sees everything else as either a backlash or a tangent or an offshoot. In my book, I have an opening chapter called The Invention of the Liberal Tradition, which is something that happens in the 1940s and 1950s in the context of the Cold War. And historians and other interpreters of the American past had never talked about that before. It has endured for a whole variety of reasons, which I think it's important for us to understand. And I'll just say, it is not an exhaustive history of illiberalism. I don't have enough years for that. But it attempts to do not to look at those moments in the past that have been particularly dreadful, but actually to look at those moments in the past that we associate with the rise and development of liberalism, and to show the ways in which illiberal sensibilities and practices and perspectives were very, very powerful and entangled liberalism itself. I look at the revolutionary period, at the 1830s, the so-called Jacksonian democracy, the Reconstruction period around issues of incarceration, progressivism, turn of the 20th century, the 1960s, the other 1960s I write about, neoliberalism, which I think is really important, and then a final chapter on specters of race and replacement.
Thank you. Jason Stanley, you write about autocracies and the F word, fascism, and how they develop. And you left a coveted professorship at Yale this year to move your family to Canada because of the political situation in our country. This got personal pretty seriously. Tell us about that, and obviously in the context of your work and study of autocracies.
Yeah, so first of all, despite suddenly being a professor of American studies, I'm a philosopher, and I've always been a philosopher. I taught Yale's philosophy of education class for 6 or 7 years. So what I do in my work is I draw on historians such as this ridiculously two historians next to me, but my work is generally, and my outlook is generally philosophical. So I use concepts that go back to Plato and Aristotle, and I see our moment, and maybe this is my fault. When I speak in front of historians, they say things like, "You're generalizing." I'm like, "Thank you," but they don't mean it that way. So I place what's happening in a philosophical context, in a global context. But I draw on, philosophically, I'm deeply influenced by the Black intellectual tradition. Figures like Martin Delany, Du Bois, these are figures that help me understand, in particular, the hypocrisy of liberal concepts. And concepts like fascism, concepts like colonialism and democracy, these are philosophical concepts that have been discussed since Thucydides, where colonialism is contrasted with democracy. If you think of the story of America in a familiar way as with internally colonized populations, as Stephen just mentioned, Black Americans, there's a long tradition of thinking of Black Americans as an internally colonized population. And then the mid-century fascism literature from Arendt to Césaire, like Arendt and Césaire, theorizes fascism as a kind of emergence of destruction of democracy from colonialism. So you're used to treating these populations undemocratically and illiberally, and that is unstable. You can't have the world's largest prison system. With Timothy Snyder and I teach a course at Yale that we're now moving to Toronto to teach, called Mass Incarceration in the United States and the Soviet Union, where we compare today with the Gulag in the early 50s, with comparable percentages in prison. So you have this background that Stephen really just talked about of illiberalism, but I'm looking at it in a global context and a philosophical context. After all, what we've seen is a sort of classic story of how democracy leads to tyranny that Plato lays out in Book 8 of the Republic. Democracy has as its chief value liberty, and so anyone can run for office, and so extremely unsuitable people will run for office, and since they're unsuitable, they'll lie their heads off, and they'll divide the people with fear and resentment, and they'll win and end democracy. So what I see and what I see in my work, I see this globally, and I think it's essential to see globally, because obviously I was recently in Tennessee, and Justin Jones, a representative there, showed me a legislation to pray that the Tennessee legislature has passed, praising in honor of the Danube Institute, which is Viktor Orban's think tank. And the Speaker of the House, Justin Jones, confronted him and said, "Do you know who Viktor Orban is?" And the Speaker of the House said, "No, I've never heard of him." So there's all sorts of international links happening. Just to end on this, the new reorganization of the State Department is going to have an office of remigration. The term remigration was the AfD's campaign slogan in the last campaign. So the connection between the AfD and the Trump regime is very clear if you know the AfD. So I'm setting things in a broad philosophical context, conceptual context, drawing on history as examples, and it just so happens that figures from Martin Delany to Angela Davis are central philosophically to me understanding the hypocrisy of liberalism.
Kara Swisher, you're one of our keenest observers and toughest critics of big tech. And here's a fun fact that I learned from your book, which is that as a college student, you studied the propaganda tools of the Nazis. And you write in the book, Hitler didn't need Instagram, and Mussolini didn't need to tweet, but just imagine if they'd had these supercharged tools. So tell us, does the technology make this moment different, or are we just stuck in the mud?
Okay, you're going with the mud. Okay.
Whatever.
Okay. Thank you. By the way, Sue Ellen, thank you for putting me on this incredibly diverse panel right here, because you make me comfortable. You look like tech people I cover. I'm obviously the DEI hire. They have eyes, they can see. One of the things that's interesting, I admire all these books, especially Steve's, which I read. I actually should have had on my podcast. I'm sitting here sort of kicking myself, but I will. Was the idea that nothing is new, right? The idea that this has all been through. And sometimes when I sit and listen, I'll get to tech in 1 second, to a lot of people, this is the worst time in history. I'm always like, the Salem witch trials are kind of bad, and the Civil War, that sucked. And going back, you could go even back to worse times. And so I think a lot about history. I was a history studies, and I did Holocaust studies was one of my areas, especially focused on propaganda. And I find that there's a lot of resonances, as used that great Mark Twain quote, by the way, dead but still funny guy. Literally, you can get a laugh out of any Mark Twain quote to this day, which is an astonishing record for him. So I think a lot about an interview I did with Yuval Harari, who has written a bunch of books. His first book, *Sapiens*, was beloved by tech bros who literally read nothing, but for some reason this one resonated. They don't like the latest one because it's quite critical of them, and they're mortified that he doesn't actually like them, which is so great. Same. And one of the things that I think about a lot is technology and the different technology. A spear is a technology, a pen is a technology, everything is a technology. These just happen to be more amplified and weaponized technologies, and in the hands of a very small group of non-diverse people. And I don't usually harp on diversity, but it's the same people, and therefore you're going to get a really bad outcome when they're from the same place, because these small group of people decide on everybody else, and the communication, when you capture the communication system, the social system, the media system now that they've been buying, and except for Lorraine Powell Jobs, who owns The Atlantic, badly managing the things they manage, from CBS News to the Washington Post, to many other places. But one of the things I think about with Yuval is when the Gutenberg Bible was made, everybody thinks we moved into this era of brilliance and Renaissance and so much smartness, and all of a sudden science, Copernicus was out there. But the very first book, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, of the Gutenberg era, the bestseller was a book called The Hammer of Witches, which I suspect these guys do know about. And it was, I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it, but he was obviously bipolar. This was about the witches, which were women or difficult people within towns. There had never been a witch hunt before this book, and it became the bestseller. And what it was a map and a guide to how to kill women, difficult women, who were largely respected in their towns, doing herbal remedies, et cetera, et cetera. And in the years that followed with this book, hundreds of thousands of people died because of it. Witch hunts were carried out. It was a bestseller, I don't know how else to put it, and inspired a lot of people. And it was a technology that allowed it to happen. And we have in our minds, just that we're talking about, that we think we know what happened with history. We think we're a liberal democracy when most of our history has been pretty sordid in a lot of ways. And one of the things that happened with this book, it was the first example of QAnon, or the idea of what QAnon was. And in one instance, which Yuval wrote about with a lot of humor, but it's also horrifying, was that these women, and one of the things they were trying to do was create a problem between men and women. These women had these trees in which they kept nests where they stole men's penises and kept them there, which is crazy. Why would we do that? Why would we keep them? And which, of course, says a lot about men. Like, of course, we'd like to keep your penis in a nest. And this man finally caught her and went and he took a different penis, but went and got his penis, well, not his, a bigger one, back. And it's crazy when you read it. Go and read The Hammer of Witches, because you're sort of like, but it does give you a sense that what's happening now is just a weaponized version, a weaponized and amplified and continuing of what's happened before. And the problem is, it's someone like Mark Zuckerberg in charge of keeping that stuff back, of which he has no interest and does not care. I wouldn't say he's malevolent or evil. I say he's ignorant and arrogant. And that really creates a bad situation for the rest of us who are downstream from all this nastiness. And I can talk about that more, but there's a story in the book, is my interview with him when I was 5-6 years ago, the last time he spoke to me, which is probably a good idea on his part. But he said that Holocaust deniers don't mean to lie. He literally said that. And instead of just hitting him at that point, I said, oh, tell me all about it. And he explained a worldview that was so ignorant and really stupid. I hate to say that about someone. And then I understood that he controlled the world's greatest information system. And I said 7-8 years from now, anti-Semitism will rise rather drastically, because you're sending chemical toxicity down the stream of information. And we used to have an information desert, now we have an information flood, and it's going to do even more damage and create much more difficult situations to get out of. And of course, either he didn't care or he didn't see it or whatever, but he certainly created a situation of which we're all in now. I feel he is.
So we're talking about information flow. We're also talking about men's penises, but we don't have to do that.
Let's not. I'm just pointing it out.
Right.
Sorry.
And the topic today includes universities and the law, so I think we need to get to that quickly. There is a war being waged on elite universities. The law is the weapon, the civil rights law of all things. Columbia has settled, and Harvard fights on, and a bunch of other people are hiding under their desks. Jason Stanley, your book is called Erasing History, and it argues that control over educational institutions is really a central feature of fascism. You call this educational authoritarianism. Is the current attack on higher ed related to any of this? Am I mixing things here? What the hell's happening?
Yeah, so there was sort of a mistake in American higher education to sideline education, to sort of treat education as like some kind of professional school rather than central to democratic citizenship. If you look, this happened in political philosophy in like the early 70s with John Rawls, but democratic political philosophers from Plato on were very clear that a political system is defined by its education system. So you have, if you want to attack a democracy, you have to attack its education system to replace it by an autocratic education system. So otherwise, people won't be fearful of each other. They'll go to school with people from different backgrounds, and they'll learn that they don't need to be afraid of them. Hitler is very clear in Mein Kampf about the kind of education system you need. Now, of course, scholars of Weimar know that Weimar set things up for Hitler because they already had a German nationalist education system. But Hitler says in Mein Kampf that we've lost the art of education. Education should be about presenting great men, great Aryan men, and then everyone learns to be proud of the great accomplishments of the great Aryan men. And so, when I learned history in school, there were no women in my textbooks. It's as if an entire human history had passed and women had never been agents. So we already had this structure in place, and what you can see, so this kind of education system tells people you have no agency, and the nation is great because of these great white men. And what we're seeing, again, maybe I'm simplifying because I tend to just see the same pattern everywhere, but this is what's happened in Hungary. If you look at So Imre Kertész, their only Nobel Prize winner, a Holocaust survivor like both of my parents, was taken off the national curriculum, the only Hungarian Nobel Prize winner in literature post-war. And look at the attack on Toni Morrison in the United States. So I see this as just another cookie-cutter authoritarian thing. And if you, like when I was marketing my book or pitching my book, people were like, people don't buy books on education. But that's because, and I was like, believe me, they will be soon. Because autocrats know, as Vladimir Putin said, wars are won by teachers.
One thing I will add as someone who is also teaching in university is, first of all, authoritarian regimes, we can think of Orban, Pinochet, wherever you look, the first thing they do is crush all those sites of opposition and potential dissent, universities being obviously prominent among them. The other thing I would say is that universities have a very complicated record of defending the principles they claim for themselves. Think about the 1950s and McCarthyism and how many people were run out or forced to take loyalty oaths. Think about the explosion of administrations and of increasingly conservative boards. And I do think, too, that universities' interest in diversity, whether it's intellectual or racial and ethnic, was always weak. And I'm not surprised. I mean, the universities have made themselves vulnerable to these attacks, but I'm not surprised that there's so much bending of the knee because their real commitment to this was very, very limited, I think.
Just to add, that's essential to understand in the current moment that universities, like every other institution, are run by anti-woke white guys.
Although I have to say, though, one of the things that universities have done, and Scott Galloway, who I work with, talks about this a lot. He's a professor, well, sort of a professor at NYU. I don't think he's been there for years now. But he brings in a lot of money, apparently, for you guys. Is that they created a situation that was elite, that did leave people out, that created like 1% of people that apply to Harvard get in, or whatever, these numbers. And so it, by nature, creates a situation where they have all these resources, they have all this money, and what they do is they limit it to become a luxury item for the very rich. And making them open for attack and justifiable attack, in that Harvard should have been creating a constituency much larger than what it has, because it is a constituency of elites and a certain amount. And so it's very, not just easy to attack, you almost kind of have to nod your head and agree with it, that they couldn't let in, they couldn't do online courses, they couldn't let in more people, they couldn't, with those billions of dollars, not do more. And I think that they don't have a constituency, and that's exactly why Donald Trump, in a very canny way, attacked Harvard first. And by the way, Harvard was attacked during McCarthyism first, if you recall, by Joe McCarthy and others. And so I think they create the situation where they don't have a constituency beyond this elite group of people, and therefore it's easy to take them down and then get all hand-wringing. The same thing with media. I would think the same thing happens with media.
I want to come back to Andrew Lawler for a question related to this, but Kara, I had a question for you. Big tech was incubated in the elite institutions, and of course they draw their talent from there. But there they were, all grinning at the second inauguration of President Trump.
Yeah, that was something to see.
What is the reporting on this? How is big tech reacting to the assault on higher ed?
If I have to give you guys a message, they don't care. Okay, let me just, like, everyone's like, oh, they're so evil. I'm like, not really. They don't care about anything but shareholders. If everything goes back to how much money they can make and how big they can get and how much they can quash competition. That's why they do these ridiculous acqui-hires, which are pretty much acquisitions. That's why they give to whoever. I joked, if Kamala Harris won, Mark Zuckerberg would call himself they, them in a second. Like, no question, right? And instead of his, I think the best line was Jimmy Kimmel. He looks like a Chechen Molly dealer, which I just can't top that. He would be a different person. They would all do that, and they would whatever they need to acquiesce to, they will. They'll give money to whoever, and so they don't, like. If you imagine they have any feelings, they don't. Whoever will, like right now, the race is on for AI, and therefore, guess what? We're going to sit in the front row of that inauguration and give him money and everything else. And Trump is very canny that way by putting them there in front of them. And if you noticed, Sam Altman, I've joked about this a number of times, Sam Altman and Tim Cook were there, but they were sitting in the back. They managed, and I asked, I said, how did they not, of course you put them in the front row. No, they wanted to be hidden. They wanted to be there but be hidden. And they said it was the greatest engineering feat in history, is hiding them in plain sight. But I think they really feel these people, especially Mark and Elon, they feel victimized. They have this weird victimization situation, even though they're the most powerful people in the world. And so it makes sense that they would be there. You know, even though it was the Trump administration who started the Google case, not the Obama. By the way, Obama was an enabler of tech, very much so. And he and I have had a lot of back and forth about this. When he had the chance to slow them down at the critical time, he did bear hugs with them. Trump was the first administration that did all those cases against Google, against Facebook, and others. And so, whatever it takes, these people will do. And that's what they're doing now with crypto. That's what they're doing now with AI, for sure. In order to get an advantage over each other and to dominate, they will do whatever it takes, and they welcome the deregulation. They never had any regulation, but the assurance that they never, ever have regulation.
I wanted to come back to Andrew Lawler and talk a little bit about the colonial period and just kind of center ourselves again in that. Andrew, can you tell us the degree to which non-governmental institutions like higher ed in its early days of the colonial period had any role in the resisting of the British, and I'm just wondering how important higher ed really is to a struggle, especially in light of some of the comments that have been made here about how it's very much part of the establishment. And is there any historical precedent that you can think of that plays into that?
Well, the Continental Army certainly used Harvard Yard back in 1775 and 1776, but no, at that point there were so few educational institutions. College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, which was basically, remember, colleges at that point were really about training ministers. It wasn't about a liberal arts education. So Princeton, what was it, the school, New Jersey College, I guess then, and then Harvard, there were very few, and in New York, King's College. So they really were not a force because a very small number of people went to these institutions. In Virginia, controlled by the gentry, the tobacco gentry I mentioned earlier, it really was, education was not important. What was important was learning how to run your feudal estate. So you might need to, read up on the classics so that you could name your slave after Cato or Caesar. But for the most part, education was really not important in Virginia. It was really one of the last colonies to institute any kind of educational system after the Revolution. But the media is different because we talk about social media today, and we mention the printing press, but really it was in the 1760s and 70s that newspapers in this country first became easily accessible and cheap, and literacy was on the rise. So most Americans actually could read at that point, and if you couldn't read, if you were an enslaved person, then your owner would read it to you if it felt appropriate. So these newspapers were the social media of their day. They were fairly new, and everybody wanted to get their hands on that daily or weekly
and crazy
newspaper.
and partisan, right?
Oh yes, in Virginia there were four newspapers, 3 in Williamsburg and 1 in Norfolk, in the port city, and they were all controlled by patriots who were very well-to-do because it was very costly to own a printing press as it is today. And so you had these people who were definitely they'd agreed essentially on a point of view. There were some subtleties in how they viewed the revolution and independence, but for the most part, they were engaged in this incredible propaganda campaign to convince those people who were beyond the gentry that it made sense to fight against the largest empire in the world. And this is one of the mysteries I was trying to untangle is why would people who were proud of being Englishmen, members of the British Empire, why would they go up against this empire? And the answer was land in Virginia. It was not about taxes. It wasn't about tea. It was about the fact that they wanted to move west to take their tobacco and enslave people west so they could get richer, George Washington being foremost among them. And the king over in Britain said, no. The white people stay to the east. The Indians are to the west. We don't want you two getting into a fight that's going to be costly and I have to pay for it. So a lot of the turmoil in the South was really based on land and enslaved people. There was also intense fear that Britain would free the slaves, which of course my book is in part about the first Emancipation Proclamation by the Royal Governor of Virginia, a Scottish aristocrat named Lord Dunmore, who made common cause with the enslaved people, put them in red coats, drilled them, sent them to fight their own owners. And their owners, in turn, were outraged because they said the British, by accepting these people as refugees, by granting them sanctuary from their forced labor camps, that the British were guilty of tyranny. Okay, you have to really stick with me on this. They're guilty of tyranny because they've stolen private property. And technically they were correct. So, and this was in the newspapers constantly hammered over and over again in those critical months in 1774 and 1775 that really culminated in the demonization of this royal governor, Lord Dunmore. He was called all kinds of, terrible names. It was claimed that he had orgies in the palace, that he had dances with black women, which is probably true. He really was integrating things in a very unusual way, and it drove the patriots crazy. So the media was really focused on demonizing this white guy who was the key to unlocking what could have been a slave insurrection that would have completely prevented Virginia and other southern states from joining the Union.
Which you're talking about, it's the same thing. It's money, money and power.
Yeah.
And the tobacco owners were similar to the tech people, and also victims.
Absolutely.
Absolute victims
They
when they
were
were the victimizers. It's like classic.
Just the importance of Andrew's book. The story he's telling is exactly what Nicole Hannah-Jones was attacked for, in describing the origins of the American Revolution. She was just viciously maligned and attacked. She was drawing on the work of Gerald Horne, one of my favorite thinkers, and she was just vilified. And Andrew just wrote a whole book going, she was right.
Yeah, and of course, I'm the white guy, right, writing the book. So, as we were talking about, they'll pay attention to you.
Right, Gerald Horne is black and has been.
So we have some time for questions. Feels like there's a through line here, which if you go back to the colonial era, the fight against autocracy was to have a different, better autocracy focused on people of color. That's kind of crazy. But I'm wondering if there are questions. We have microphones on both sides. Come on up and we'll do them.
I have a question for Andrew. Can you talk more about the gun control issue in the revolution?
Oh, great. This is great. So the problem that the gentry had in 1775 in Virginia was convincing these white farmers who, for the most part were happy being members of the British Empire. How do you convince them to join this fight, to really put everything at risk? And Patrick Henry was an incredible populist. He was a lawyer, land speculator, but he also understood the small white farmers who dominated the population of Virginia, aside from the enslaved people. And let me give this quote. So in April of 1775, when y'all were up here busy fighting the British election in Concord, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, took gunpowder out of the arsenal in the colonial capital of Williamsburg. And this really pissed off the Patriots, in part because they were afraid of a slave insurrection. So here's a quote. Then Patrick Henry said just after that, he wrote to a friend, "You may in vain talk to the people about the duties on tea, etc. These things will not affect them. They depend on principles too abstracted for their apprehension and feeling. But tell them of the robbery of the magazine, and that the next step will be to disarm them. And you bring the subject home to their bosoms, they will be ready to fly to arms to defend themselves."
Yeah.
There was no British plan to disarm anybody in Virginia. So this was really, really a smart move, because Patrick Henry was able to take this fear of losing their guns, which was the guns were that gave the whites a capacity to control the enslaved population. So this was just waving a red flag in front of these people, and they joined in droves. Up until that point, you only had the gentry really filling the ranks of the militia. Suddenly, you had all these people showing up, and it was all because Patrick Henry understood how to manipulate the public in order to do this.
The topic, it's essentially the Epstein files of that era, because that's what Trump did with
Never made that connection.
Think about it.
Like
I mean,
that,
there's certain things that work and certain things that don't.
Yeah.
Whether it's immigration, there's a certain thing that gels. And the problem Trump has now, which I'll talk about tomorrow, with the Epstein files, is he's fed them this toxic story of the deep state, the Epstein files, the cabal, etc. And now he's sucked up into it. And I don't think he understood how much a pillar of it was. And in the case then, it was guns. Yeah. It's still guns, but it's a really interesting thing that you find the thing that works. And in this era, you can amplify it really drastically compared. But there, they did just fine. Like I said, they did just fine.
The first piece I wrote in the New York Times in 2011 was on birtherism. Because I was seeing like a democratic information space is poisoned by conspiracy theories.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them work better than others.
And remember that this nation was founded on the conspiracy theory that Britain intended to enslave the white population. I mean, that was what motivated people. So our country is actually based on this principle that really had no basis in fact.
We have a question.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, hi. So
Wasn't Obama going to do that?
I think it was Kara who referenced the phrase "the worst time in history," and many people feel that way. What about the many respected commentators who say this is the best time in history across 20 easily measurable items? There are more black and Hispanic people in Congress who own homes, who own 2 cars, who are CEOs, who are in management, who are getting education at higher rates. There were marches 2 years ago for a $15 an hour minimum wage. And now it's 20 in California for fast food. And generally jobs pay 20 and 22, or you can't get anybody. If you have cancer, if you're gay, you'd rather be now than 10 years ago. What about that?
That was the point I was making, is that when people are on a 5-alarm fire all the time, it doesn't have any resonance. And by most standards, it's a better time than ever in terms of a lot of things. Not for everybody, but certainly for a vast majority, comparatively to previous times. We're not dying of, and then name whatever thing you want. I think the problem is that the Republican Party is a whole other story. It's become a Trump party, as Jeff was pointing out last night. But what the Democratic Party has done, and I just have done recent interviews with a lot of what I think really exciting Democrats, actually. They're talking about, I just interviewed Sarah McBride, who's been relentlessly attacked by that crazy Nancy Mace. And instead, she's trans, she represents Delaware. They only have one person representing them because it's a small state. And her point was, we have to have uncomfortable allies constantly, and we have to start to get together with people we may not agree with. That's how gay marriage was passed. That's how lots of things were passed. And so one of the things I think the Democrats do badly is they're telling us everything that they're focused on Trump, which is exactly where Trump wants them to be focused, rather than what they're going to do, whether it's better, we're going to get this for you, we're going to get this for you, we're going to do this, we believe in this. And one of the really interesting things about Mamdani, whatever you think of him, his messaging is perfect online, by the way, because it's not about, anything except I'm going to get you cheaper rents, I'm going to get you better food, I'm going to get you this. And so I think one of the problems is the messaging of the opposite party is so doom and gloom that it makes it very difficult when it's not what the way people are living and not addressing people's real problems, which we've talked about a lot, which are very real, and the anger is very real.
Well, one of the things I think it's important to recognize is, those examples that he mentioned were products of long-term political struggles for rights that expanded and that succeeded, but we also need to understand that history can go backwards.
Right.
History it's not a sort of steady march forward. It can go backwards, it can go sideways. And so one of the things that's characteristic, I think, of this moment is the withdrawal, the persecution, the repression of those people and those struggles that had managed to achieve an America that we would not have seen 6 or 7 decades ago.
Right, 100%.
Hi. So I have a question about universities, but first of all, I just would like to give a tiny defense of Harvard and others as far as elitism goes. I was a professor there for over 30 years, and I can assure you that Harvard made a real attempt to, in fact, diversify, and it made a lot of students who couldn't afford to pay. Anyone whose family earned less than $100,000 got full scholarships.
That's not what I was talking
No,
about.
no. I was talking to Jason, who said, these places are bastions of elitism, and it's partly their fault, et cetera.
No, that's what
That
Carol
was me.
So I don't.
He looks like he'd say that.
Right, I agree with Carol.
I kind of said that too.
No, but, okay. So, in fact, I think what they're doing now, what Trump and others are trying to do now, is to restore that elitism
Right.
that used to be and get rid of what they call the woke ideology, no DEI, don't admit students based on anything other than, their SAT scores or something. But what I would like to ask you is, what is the best way to persuade people like Alan Garber of Harvard, which some of us are trying to do, don't cave in, do not pay money, because autocrats never are happy with what they get. They always ask for more until they get total capitulation. So give me some arguments
Right.
about
What I was talking about is over the past 10 years, they have done a lot more diversity. And listen, when you think of diversity, equity, inclusion, the opposite words are homogeneity, inequality, and exclusion, right? I mean, that's a prescription for children without teeth, essentially, if you're doing it biologically, right? It's like you create a real problem. I think what they didn't do over the many years some of the stuff was laudable, some of it was overdone, I think, normally, as it always happens.
Right.
But what they didn't do is expand itself into a different kind of thing so that they would be more protected with a bigger audience by not letting people in, by restricting, not expanding the student body, why do they have 1,000 freshmen? Why don't they have 10,000 freshmen? And then you have a constituency all around you that is harder to attack. That to me, they had so many things they could have done. They should have seen it coming. And in Garber's position, he's in a very bad position. If you lose all that research money, that's devastating to Harvard. And so on some level, I'm not so sure he can resist for this point in history. That'll all change again after Trump's gone. I mean, I think that's the difficulty, is what to do right now when so much. I'm working on a new book about a lot of healthcare in the future, and it's so much research is at risk right now. That's really. I was at a lab at Harvard that's doing astonishing work on something called millibots, which are little metal things that are going to travel through your body and solve diseases using magnets. It's crazy. But the entire lab was full of immigrants and led by a woman from China who wants to be here but is going to have to leave and bring all that innovation to China.
Quickly, I served on the Yale Faculty Senate for the past 5 years, which is divided between the scientists and the humanists. And the scientists were like, well, we don't go in for any of that woke shit. And we were like, what are you guys talking about China? Like, they were like, this scientist is under attack because of connections to China. And we didn't really understand that, and they didn't really understand what we were talking about with gender studies and stuff. Many of them, not all of them. But then, when the Trump regime came in, they targeted the scientists, because if you're going to rob a bank, you don't rob the gender studies bank. And quickly the scientists became mobilized because they're frankly better than we are at that. But one thing about Garber and what Harvard has been doing is they've been unilaterally dismantling. They've been going along with the presuppositions, which is that Harvard and Yale have enormous anti-Semitism problems because half the Jewish students are protesting Israel. And, so they've accepted the presuppositions. And they've accepted the presupposition that DEI and quote-unquote wokeism has gone so far and too far. And the mainstream media has supported them there. If you read the New York Times op-ed page, they have done dozens of concern-trolling articles about leftists on campus. Yeah. This is as Moira Weigel has shown in her essays for The Guardian, this is the political correctness stuff from the 90s, but it's been laundered by centrist liberals.
They were always like that.
Okay,
you
one
know
more
that.
question. We're going to squeeze in one more question.
You're getting to my question. I am a proud public school grad from the South, so the oddest bird in Martha's Vineyard that you're going to meet, right? And so this history is so recent, like Lee Atwater and Jesse Helms are dancing in their graves. And so I'm not seeing that from the media when we roll out, we go from force busing to CRT to DEI to woke. Like, I'm not seeing that pushback from the media in terms of us being played by that playbook again. I don't. So help me with that.
Well, Lee Atwater was one of the most dangerous people in history, a very affable person. If you want to read a great essay, Marjorie Williams wrote a piece when he was dying that I thought was devastating and correct.
And he asked for forgiveness, but he's still being played every day.
Yeah, she didn't give him forgiveness. He didn't deserve it either. One of the things that's really important to think about, and they would know more about this because of education, is that these tools are the same tools. Yeah. It's repetition, it's confusion, it's flooding the zone. Just read Steve Bannon. I know he's an unattractive people to a lot of people. I spent a lot of time paying attention to Steve Bannon. Read Goebbels. Read his stuff, what he said. It's all the same stuff as a repellent is. So it's not new stuff. It's just new tools. And the tools that are coming with AI, I cannot underscore how confusing they will make our populace, because they're so, everyone laughs at like, oh, AI has 7 fingers, ha ha ha. I'm like, it won't have 7 fingers in 5 minutes. It will be perfect.
But when Scott craps on DEI,
Yeah.
then he holds that up. You see what I'm
Yes.
saying? DEI is my pillar.
Yes.
White woman.
Well,
only.
Scott
Yeah.
says a lot of stupid things, so I don't know what to tell you about
I
that.
would just add that it's really important for us to understand how important the American South has been to embedding illiberalism. Think about what Tocqueville called the domestic dictatorships of enslavement. Think about Jim Crow. Think about collections of what has been called authoritarian enclaves in the South that were, also grew up in the Trans-Mississippi West and other parts of the country. But, for so long, the South, including during the New Deal in the 1930s, was an enormous obstacle to moving forward, and the way in which enslavement and race became central to the whole construction of different kinds of illiberalism.
I think we're going to have to
Can I just make one point to leave on a happy note?
Please.
Joe Rogan's getting pretty woke these days. I don't know if you've noticed, but the shift is happening now, and it starts with Epstein. He's now talking about colleges. How can they be difficult to leftists on campus for just speaking their mind? He just said that the other day. I almost,
Amazing.
It was
Amazing.
amazing. So there is a shift back the other way, because as usual, this group has gone a little too far. And even though we all laugh at the Epstein stuff, it is what will kill them. It's what will.
Thank you. That was a great ending. That was an excellent ending. Andrew, thank you so much. Thank you to our panel. Don't forget, our panel is going to the book signing tent right now to sign books. So we are going to make a change to our next panel.